Greetings to you all. This is Tendai Dumbuchena, host of the Africa in Crisis podcast. Welcome to the fourth episode, which examines the state of governance on our continent. What do we mean by good governance? To me, it has four elements. First, the principle that those who govern do so with the consent of the governed, expressed in free and fair elections. Second, the strict application of the rule of law to ensure that all people, institutions, and interest groups are subject to law that is fairly applied and enforced. Third, that those who govern manage public finances and resources with the utmost transparency and integrity and are at all times held to account. And fourth, respect for human rights and gender equality. In the early years of independence, African countries, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, it was unrealistic to expect high standards of governance. Conditions for that simply did not exist. These were new nations whose borders had been unilaterally drawn up by colonial powers. Statecraft was a skill the leaders of the new nations did not possess. The economies of these new states were hardly developed, with subsistence farming the dominant form of economic activity. There were very few people with the knowledge and skills to run nation states. There wasn't the economic, institutional, and social basis to build democratic governance. Inevitably, dictatorships were the order of the day. Even dictators of a benevolent disposition had very little to work with. In the 1960s to 1980s, virtually all African nations were either one-party states or military dictatorships. It was a prolonged era of strong men. Just to mention a few: Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo; Hastings Banda of Malawi; Mohamed Said Barre of Somalia; Muammar Gaddafi of Libya; Uganda's Idi Amin; Jean Badel Bokassa of the Central African Republic. These were some of the strong men who defined that period. These were men who ruled their countries like personal fiefdoms. Three of that ilk, unfortunately, still remain to remind us of that dark period in African history. Paul Biya of Cameroon; Teodoro Obiang Mbasogo of Equatorial Guinea; and Yoweri Museveni of Uganda. These three leaders have ruled their countries for a combined 119 years. Much progress has been made across the continent, but there is still a long way to go. It was difficult for people understandably focused on making ends meet to challenge these entrenched and often brutal leaders. There was no hesitation on their part to use the coercive apparatus of the state to crush dissent. A game changer was the geopolitical earthquake of the collapse of the Eastern European Communist countries in 1989, followed by the breakup of the Soviet Union 2 years later. No longer able to exploit the ideological divide of the Cold War, African countries were pressured by Washington and its allies to embrace multi-party political systems and market-driven economies. In the early 1990s, in quick time, Tanzania, Kenya, Zambia, Malawi, and Mozambique abandoned the one-party model. This was replicated in all other regions of sub-Saharan Africa. The external imposition of the multi-party model could only have limited impact. Very few countries had genuine desire to truly democratize and build rules-based societies. The existence of a plurality of political parties and regular elections presented a facade of democracy, behind which electoral malpractice, human rights violations, and corruption continued. There was no effort to build the institutions that are guardrails for democracy and constitutionalism. The African Union took a strong stand against military coups when it was founded in 2002 to replace the Organization of African Unity, OAU. There was progress made which gave hope that the continent had gotten rid of the scourge of military coups. But coups in Egypt, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Zimbabwe stalled this progress. In 2002, the AU adopted a declaration on democracy, political, economic, and corporate governance. The declaration, which was intended to complement NEPAD, the New Economic Partnership for Africa's Development, committed to, and I quote, just, honest, transparent, accountable, and participatory government and probity in public life, unquote. What was crucial about the AU's declaration and its adoption of NEPAD was the affirmation of the link between good governance and economic growth. Developed countries were on board to partner Africa grow its economies on condition that all elements of good governance were upheld. This gave many people hope that Africa would finally be set on a path to sustained economic growth and good governance. Unfortunately, commitments to good governance by Africa were more honored in their breach than observance. While we acknowledge the progress that has been made in the past 20 years, much remains to be done. I thank you. Listeners, what do you think is the state of governance in Africa? What progress has been made, if any, in your view? What do you want to see done? Please post your comments below.